Ok, voy a esperar unos minutos que entren los participantes. I will wait for 10 minutes before people is coming. Now it's open.
I'm going just in case to put
Okay, since we are on time. Buenas noches. Bueno, ya me presento igualmente como de costumbre. Soy Edgardo Zablocki, soy rector del UCEMA. Y voy a introducir, bueno, una nueva sesión, la última de este primer ciclo, por cierto, de la Cátedra Lord Acton, que esperamos que el próximo año tenerla nuevamente, tener el privilegio de tenerla en un UCEMA. Los dejo con Alejandro Chafuen, quien va a ser, como de costumbre, moderador. Hoy tenemos el honor de tener al padre Robert. Alex, muchas gracias.
Y como anunciamos, la introducción y el programa hoy va a ser en inglés. A los que no entienden inglés, hay el libro del padre Sirico, ¿no?, en defensa de la economía libre, ha sido publicado por el Instituto Acton y se puede conseguir allí. También pueden ver en un programa que se grabó hace un par de meses con el Instituto Acton, que es un co-sponsor de este programa. Bueno, good evening, Edgardo, and good evening, Father Robert Sirico. What a privilege it is to end this first Lord Acton chair with the founder and president of the Acton Institute. I was corresponding, I think, with Father Sirico in the late 90s, in the late 80s, but in 1990, it was the first time I had the privilege of seeing him in action. He spoke at the Montpellerin Society meeting in Guatemala. And I still recall, so many things of that trip, even how he was taking dollar bills for the poor when we were walking in the street. The poor were coming and seeking his help. But the most important thing that out of that conversation, I think Father Robert decided to start the Acton Institute together with Chris Mauren, the executive director of Acton Institute. There was a lack of talented economists paying attention to the Christian foundations of the free society. Christians were neglecting the importance of sound economics. And Father Robert decided this great adventure of the Acton Institute, and we have been blessed, beyond imagination by the growth of the think tank. We have the largest network in the sort of free market movement. More than 450 organizations in 140 countries belong to our Poverty Cure network. Father Sirico is a great intellectual, great priest. He not only he directs, is president of the Acton Institute. He has a school, he has a church. He's one of the most sought after speakers in the world, especially in matters of ethics and economics. And I do not know anyone who has done more than him to speak about the importance of the entrepreneurial vocation, about the importance of a free economy, to religious leaders, in a big tent, from the Judeo-Christian world, but also we try to reach with other religions as well. Very busy. I have to thank him tremendously for being with us this evening. And I asked Father Robert to make some introductory remarks, so then we can enter into a period of questions and answers. Thank you, Father Robert, for being with us.
Thank you, Alex, for your very generous, too generous introduction. I will give you absolution at the end of the seminar for all of the lies that you have pronounced here, but delighted to be with you. I wish we could be together in person. if for no other selfish reason than having good Argentinian steak together and a bottle of wine from Mendoza. I miss being in Argentina, and I hope that it will not be too long in the future when I'll be able to come and visit again. We're meeting at both the way in which we're meeting, but at the time in which we're meeting bespeaks a world pandemic. We're all sadly aware of it, maybe too aware of it. And there's a lot to be said from this common experience that we are having as it relates precisely to the question of ethics and economics. So I want to begin with my brief remarks to look at these questions through that lens, the fact that virtually, excuse me for joking with the word, virtually the entire world is having a common experience. That doesn't happen very often. You know, maybe a moon landing would do that. But now in real time, we're experiencing, and all the more because of the advance of technology that enables us to hear things almost instantaneously, we are experiencing a similar crisis with regard to contagion, the spread of the disease, the effects of it, and all of the rest of it, all of which could be debated and has been and will be outside of this forum. But as it pertains to us, it raises some questions with regard to how we remedy, how we've responded, and how we remedy this question that inevitably involves questions of economics, questions of business, questions of government regulation and government intervention, and of course, deep and profound ethical questions with regard to all of that. So let me say that I think the general economic ignorance that exists in world leadership, generally speaking, there are exceptions to this. And there have been moments where we thought these ideas of human freedom and prosperity would take center place, that we see now that the leadership of most countries is a leadership dominated by central planners, that when there is a problem, the solution to the problem is seen as some form of government action, some form of government regulation, some form of centralized planning or subsidy. And what this does is crowd out the very people who know best what is going on in their locality. I mean, I don't know the various regions of Argentina, much less the extent of the contagion in those various regions, but I will wager to say that in different areas of Argentina at different times, you have different rates, how hot the contagion is. If you look at statistics with regard to the state in the United States in which I am living, Michigan, we hear that there are these rise in cases of the infection. And yet, when you look at it on a more local level, you have one whole area of the state where there is virtually no rise, a complete dive in the contagion rate, and another that's enormously high. And yet, when you hear it reported as a collective, you get the impression that the entire state is the same thing. This is also an example of the kind of centralized planning, the centralized mentality, and then, of course, the response to it. In our own local area, a year ago when all of this happened, there was a rush on toilet paper at all of the grocery stores. Everyone was concerned that they wouldn't have enough toilet paper. In our church, what we did was we took all of the toilet paper from the school, brought it into the office, and then proceeded to call parishioners and tell them that we had it available. They were very grateful to hear it, but the fact of the matter is that most people weren't worried. They didn't need it. I think maybe one or two people had the need for it. We knew our local people. We knew our local resources. Meanwhile, the state was plotting and planning and issuing, and over a period of time, enormous history-breaking amounts of money that were allocated to this. Now, I'm not just talking about toilet paper, of course. I'm talking about all kinds of things where money was being made available and without consideration of how this would be used and the way in which the local levels of society were marginalized. We also saw this phenomenon, philosophers call this a phenomenon of when the hammer to a hammer, everything is a nail. So that in the hospital systems, they forbade even people who were dying to have access to a priest or to their families. And I wrote to the director of the local hospital here. This is the largest hospital system in the city in which I live. So it involves about 10 or 20 hospitals. And I said, how can it be that you have people cleaning the rooms and people delivering food to those rooms, but you won't let a priest come into the room at the point of a person's death or even the family to be with the dying? Again, they were just looking at people as though that all they were patients rather than as people. And I think the government has done that, and we will, in generations to come, have to pay for the emergency funds that have been allocated in the trillions upon trillions of dollars in response to this. Now, what all this says is that the approach to society, to social networking, is seen as something essential for the state to be the first actor. The state has to act first, and that sounds plausible, except when you see things on the real level. When the state acts first, it marginalizes the mediating institutions, the local institutions, whether it's a local parish or family, extended families or businesses in a given area. The shutdowns that have been also, I think, very narrow in their understanding of the interrelationship between economy and human health have been very deleterious, very harmful to society as a whole, because what we know from all economic studies that we have is that the healthiest societies, the societies that are physically the healthiest, are those societies that are the most prosperous. So if you turn off the valve of prosperity, as though the business owners themselves were not interested in the well-being of their people, I mean, if you kill off all your customers, then you don't have any customers, you go out of business, right? But when you do that, when you force businesses to close, and in highly selective ways, again, I don't know the concrete situation in Argentina, but I do know that in the United States, there were businesses that were closed and businesses that were permitted to operate, and the church was closed. I don't know in Argentina if you can go to mass, but here in the United States, we've opened up now. But at the beginning, even the churches were closed. And what that meant was that people went without the kind of support and sustenance, spiritual sustenance, at the same time that they allowed bars, certain kinds of liquor sales, and tattoo parlors to operate. So there was a prejudice against religion because religion was seen as a non-essential service. And again, this goes back to the centralized planning mentality, where the government is the means of first resort. I think we're going to see for years to come, as this thing begins to clear up, that many very dangerous mistakes were made right at the outset of the pandemic, and a lot of them had to do with economic fallacies and a presumed extensive role for the state. The real challenge for our world today, and I know that Argentina is passing through a very difficult moment that relates to this, is that most people don't understand what markets are. They don't understand what profit is. They don't understand what business is. They see under the influence of many Marxist and quasi-Marxist thinkers, and this has to do certainly in the governmental area, but it also has to do with the church, and it has to do even in the business sector, that the idea is that the pie is static. The wealth of a nation stays stable, and that the essential action on the part of government leaders, on the part of moral leaders, is to call for a redistribution of that wealth. Then when business owners get involved in this kind of mentality, what you end up happening is a kind of crony capitalism or a state capitalism. I think Argentina, very sadly, has experienced this for many, many decades, so much so that generations of Argentinian philosophers and theologians and even business people think that the way for them to succeed is by becoming very close to the state. The system of patronage really ends up impeding the creative activity of people in the marketplace. I said earlier that people don't understand what a market is. They think that if somebody makes money in a market, somebody else has had money taken away from them in a market. They don't understand what profits mean in a society, and I'm sure that your highly sophisticated audience understands the importance of information and their connection to prices, that the pricing system must be free in order for people to know what is relatively scarce and relatively rare in society, that the scarcity of products is the reason that products in a free economy are more expensive. And the abundance of those same products are the reasons, and again, in a free society, the reasons that those products are less expensive. But when you have regulation and taxation and this kind of cronyism that impedes competition because one competitor has gotten into the ear of a politician who can control regulation and the various kinds of legislation that inhibits trade, then what ends up happening is the information that would normally flow through the pricing system is obfuscated. It becomes unuseful and even harmful, where producers overproduce one kind of good and underproduce another kind of good because they're getting false messages. So all of this, of course, ties in to the ethical question, and none more so than the question of inflation. When governments spend, what they have to do in order to maintain these levels of spending is inflate the money supply. And when the money supply is inflated, you have a deeply problematic moral question, because it means that those especially on fixed incomes, the most vulnerable people who can't get their money out of the country, who don't have their money invested in art and jewelry and other things, the most vulnerable people are the first and most dangerously impacted by the kind of inflationary spirals that we see. The most recent deep example is what's going on in Venezuela at this very moment. So this is the interconnection of all of these questions having to do with economy, with human well-being, with health, and with the nature of the human person, the dignity of the human person, because the human person is the actor who is the creator in a market economy when that economy is left generally free, certainly framed in the context of a juridical system One hopes that it has an ethic at its core, and that, of course, is the responsibility of the church to teach virtue, to teach ethics, to teach people that false contracts are evil, that lying is evil, that honesty is a virtue that needs to be practiced even when it costs us something, that when we have an ethical society, when we have a free society, we can have a society that is also a virtuous society. And unfortunately, as I say, many of our political leaders, many of our religious leaders don't understand how the market economy functions. And as a result of that, we have the kind of catastrophes that we're seeing unfold with regard to the pandemic. The tendency is that when there is a crisis, the government is the first to act, to increase the regulations, to increase the control on people, and to increase the subsidies, which are forms of taxation, because eventually they're going to have to be paid. If we didn't have to worry about stimulus spending, then why stop at $4 trillion? Let's have 10 or $20 trillion if we didn't have to worry about that. But of course, we do have to worry about that. Now, people will ask me, well, the economy needs to be stimulated because there is, even if you had no regulations, there are things that have impeded the ability of people to work. People become sick. People are concerned in having proximity with one another. Supply chains are disrupted and all of that. The economy needs to be stimulated, and I agree with that. The question is, what is the better stimulus? The government inflationary policies that spend taxpayers' money before taxpayers have even paid that money in, or some kind of program that gives businesses a tax holiday and gives citizens a tax holiday, where our taxes are radically reduced for a period of time, leaving that money in our hands and in our families. That too would stimulate the economy, and it would stimulate the economy in a way that doesn't have to be paid back for generations. And also remember, many of these programs, of stimulus programs, again, I speak in the United States, but I can imagine that there are similar kinds of programs operative throughout Latin America, want to subsidize things that have nothing directly to do with the pandemic itself. We've, up here in the States, we've had art museums subsidized. I've been offered money for my school. We've turned it all down. The Acton Institute has been offered money. I personally, my sister just died 2 months ago, and I received a notice from FEMA, which is our social system of help in emergency, offering to pay for my sister's funeral. My sister didn't die of COVID. My sister died of natural causes. And I could have put that in and asked for the money for the funeral. But I thought to myself, I'm taking this money away from someone else if I accept this kind of a grant. So it takes economic knowledge and a strong ethical sensibility to push aside these kinds of offers that the government is giving to businesses, to churches, to individuals. But if we don't do that as a society, and I know that right now we're in a very difficult situation because people on the whole don't understand how market economy functions, to the extent that we continue to do that, we're going to be in a very dangerous situation. Friedrich Bastiat made the observation that the state is the great lie, the great myth that says everyone can live at everyone else's expense. At some point, the wallet in front of you is going to be empty. And the question is not how to redistribute wealth, but how to create it. And that we know how to do. I'll stop there. I think I've been provocative enough, and I'm happy to accept any questions. I am sorry that my Spanish is very rough. If I tried to speak it, it would come out Italian. So I'm glad for the help that with the translations.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Father Robert. I asked the audience to put the questions in the chat, not in the chat, in the question and answers. And if you put in Spanish, I would translate them to English as best as I can. One of most, we already have a question from Daniel Lacalle, but I want to speak about what you just said about economic education and the misunderstanding of economics. One of the most rewarding things preparing for your presentation was that I went back to some of your writings that were published in books that were published by the Vatican, by the Vatican, Libreria Vaticana. In one of them, you mentioned how economists and businessmen mistake things about economics. But sometimes there are economists who enter into the area of morality that create a problem. Let me read 2 paragraphs from a book published by the Libreria Editrice Vaticana in 1998. The book was called Centésimos Annus, Assessment and Perspective for the Future in Catholic Social Doctrine. And this is what you wrote, Father Robert. You said, a clear understanding of what is meant by a market economy is rarely grasped in all its dimensions, even by economic actors and economists. And then you say, the market, even while possessing practical virtues, remains essentially morally neutral, and thus in need of a broader framework in which to operate in a manner that could be considered ethical. And then you repeat John Paul II says, it would be a great mistake to think of the market as possessing an ethic in itself. To do this would be to run the risk of falling into the error the Holy Father warns against when he speaks in Centésimos Annus of a radical capitalist ideology. I know that I sometimes flirted with radical capitalist philosophy, but can you point to some actors or people who you think that they are invading in a way the fields that they don't command, and creating this misunderstanding about the evils of capitalism or the free economy?
Yes, and let me say, I'm reluctant to name names because I don't want to be taken out of context. Many of these people are friends or have been friends in the past, but who fail to have a kind of teleological or natural law view of the world. So it becomes very utilitarian, their approach, because of efficiency. Efficiency is good, and they confuse this functional goodness with moral goodness. So I remember, I would say that sometimes in some aspects, even Ludwig von Mises certainly comes out of that more economistic way of seeing the world. Ayn Rand, in a very different way, would participate in that. I remember once I was asking a beloved friend of mine who has now passed, Walter Williams, how he determines whether something is good. And I was asking the question good in reference to ethics, morality. And he said, well, if it's free, it's good. Another person I spoke to once from the Cato Institute said, look, I don't believe in religion, but I'm glad to have you working for freedom. Because in my estimation, he said, liberty is the most important thing. Liberty is the most important virtue. And the fact that you believe in a God that doesn't exist, he said, is irrelevant as long as you're promoting liberty. Well, of course, the idea that liberty itself is the end goal of anyone's life, much less society as a whole, I think is highly problematic. And I don't think any reasonable person really believes that, because we all constrain our liberty in various ways, right? When we do something that a loved one wants us to do, not because we want to do it, but because you love that person, that transcends your freedom. I mean, in a way, it's an act of your freedom, but another way, it's a constraint on you. It's an interior constraint. It's not the kind of constraint that a state would have, but it's nonetheless a form of constraint, a power that people have, or rather an authority that people have over one another. And you can see that not just in marital relationships, but you can see it in forms of aesthetics, of etiquette. It used to be that a man would remove his hat when entering a room, or let a lady go through a door first. I know this sounds very antiquated, but these are the bourgeois values that enabled us to function as a polite society, even when we didn't feel any affection for the person to whom we were being polite, without government regulation. Now, I think a lot of the woke movement that we have, I think a lot of the cancel culture that we have, and the real bitter kind of exchanges that we see in the popular culture as a whole, are the result of this coarsening of society is the result of the reduction of these mediating institutions and these virtue-embedded traditions in society. So I think that economists who think that the only thing is important is freedom are committing an anthropological mistake. I remember once in a conversation with our mutual friend, Milton Friedman, may he rest in peace, and I had an exchange of letters with him on this topic. He said that the papal encyclical that you just referred to, Centesimus Annus, worried him because in it the Pope spoke about the liberty needing to be oriented to the truth. And he said, who's going to enforce that? He says, it sounds like shades of the Inquisition. And I said to him, Milton, what if the truth of which we speak is not a coercive truth? What if the truth of which we speak is a truth that we want to propose to people rather than impose upon people? Wouldn't that seem to be the way to go? And he said, no, not when religion is involved. I mean, he was such a man of the Enlightenment that that's the only way he could see the function of religion rather than as a culture. Now, on the other hand, Friedrich Hayek was much more open to this notion, especially in his book published, I believe, posthumously. Wasn't The Fatal Conceit published after his death? I don't remember the date on that.
Before.
In that book, he elaborates the notion of the importance of the way in which freedom transfers information from generation. I'm sorry, not freedom. Tradition transfers information from generation to generation. So I think he had more of shall I say, a Catholic sensibility in that regard.
You know, good that you bring the great Milton Friedman. You know, UCEMA, the University Our House, also employs, that was founded by people who have studied with Milton Friedman, but has been very open to all the insights of Austrian economics, many times hosting Gabriel Zanot, this great Argentinian philosophers. We have several questions, and one came from Daniel Lacalle, this great Spanish economist, and you already addressed it a little bit, you know, with this government being, you know, the lenders of first resort in each crisis, and with this enormous volumes of money poured into the market. Daniel was, even before the pandemic, we saw that this government-run and directed economy and all the liquidity and the money printing in Europe was not leading to higher growth, despite this almost 0% interest rates. And so he was asking, you know, what the effect you think this will have on innovation, being in this environment of always stimulus, like a drug addict. But I want to connect it with what you said. I don't know if you use the name of the principle of subsidiarity. It seems that what you were explaining about the top-down solution that it basically crowds out the lessons and the wisdom that comes from allowing those who are closer to the problem to come up with solutions. Can you elaborate a little bit about the importance of this principle and the impact that today's economic stimulus flood might create on this?
Yes,
issue?
well, I mean, it bears, defining what we mean by subsidiarity. I presume that Latin American audience of this sophistication would understand what it is, but in case we have some people who don't, subsidiarity, the word subsidium comes from the supplies that a Roman platoon, Roman legion would take into battle with it. And it was a cache of weapons and food and supplies that was sealed. So it would go into battle, and if the supply lines were cut off, they could then open that subsidium, that help, that's what the word means in Latin, to carry out their functions. When the supply lines were opened again, the subsidium would be closed again. So it only was in an emergency use. And then at the most local level, so the principle of subsidiarity says that governments should aid lower levels of society only when there is profound need, and only in a graduated way, so that the first resource was the neighborhood, the extended family, the parish, the various charitable institutions that exist and would come into existence if the government wasn't presuming this role of patronage constantly. Many of these kinds of mediating institutions have been obliterated in some countries simply because the government is there to do it. And the potency of these more local organizations, these more proximate groups of people, the potency of it is that they know what the real needs are. They know if my sister died of COVID versus a brain aneurysm. And the government doesn't know that. So they just send it out to everybody, and most people are going to respond and say, sure, I'll take the money. So it impedes creativity because it's impeding knowledge. What the after effects of this will be on society, I don't know. It's going to be, it's got to be a generation or two before we come back to our senses. And only then, if we don't try to resolve the crisis that we're going to face as the result of these stimulus packages, there's going to be something to pay for this, whether it comes in the form of inflation or collapse of economies or an inhibition or what's the word I want? The decrease in creativity in society. However it comes, it's coming. You just can't make up reality. It's like defying the law of gravity.
One question. Thank you, Father. Very great explanation. It's important to clarify the importance of this principle. One of the questions comes from Alejandro Pontel. Given the situation in Argentina, luckily there's a lot of youth who see the value of the free economy and the damage caused, by controls by the government, but they want to enter politics. I don't know, partisan politics and non-partisan politics, but they realize they face some problems in how to show the consistency of the free economy in promoting the common good. Do you have any special message for the youth? How would you go about it? In those countries, promoting that the youth get involved and spread the message, consistent with what you have learned about the economy and the importance of the common good.
Well, I don't want to denigrate the role of politics, because there is a place for politics in society. But if I were speaking to a young person about it, the first thing I would say is examine your conscience. Really, before God, before your conscience, in the the sanctity of your own heart, ask yourself why. Because what comes with huge government programs and amounts of money that's being poured out is this notion that the most important actors in our society are politicians. And indeed, they are the most powerful, and they shouldn't be. So to contribute to that notion, if you're going into politics because you think this is the most important position in society, then I have to say you're mistaken. If you go into politics, it should be with a very clear and ruthless belief that government needs to be cut, that taxations need to be reduced, regulations need to be reduced, the status of politicians themselves needs to be reduced in the culture as a whole. What we need to do is allow these other actors in society, teachers, and by that I don't mean union advocates of government programs. I mean people who teach children, who are concerned with the teaching of children, people in local environments, local cities and municipalities, who should be the doctors and the scientists, the clergy, and parents. I mean, the most important function in any society is to be a good mother and a good father, because that's the future right in your hands and in your home. You can direct that. And I don't want to again say it's a sin to be in politics, but it's a sin to be in politics if you're only attracted to politics by the power. Lord Acton put it very well. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And by the way, he wasn't first speaking to politicians in that statement. He was speaking to the church and the church's proximity to government. And we have tendencies now in the church that want to, in effect, hand over our role to the state, our social functions to the state. I mean, when the church ran the social institutions, we were able to form the moral conscience of people who we were serving. And now that the church has been marginalized because of a secularized state, to ask to receive more money from those governments, which very often come with certain strings attached, I know it differs from country to country, but I think is slitting our own throats. So my advice would be to say, be very careful, understand that the end of politics is an authentic common good, that the government doesn't guarantee the common good. The ethic of the society guarantees the common good, that the role of government is to provide the context in which that can happen. But the government, Pope Benedict said in one of his encyclicals, the government that presumes to give everything to everyone is the government that will soon kill everyone, because it will have complete control over human life.
As I'm privileged to be employed at Acton, I have to pass a little bit of the propaganda, I think, to complement all the good things that Father Robert said. You know, and Argentina has a huge spike now in poverty, and you have to sympathize with the poor. But Acton has wonderful programs which have been praised even sometimes by the left. The two movies, you know, Poverty Inc. and Poverty Cure series, but also we have short films about the creative power of the entrepreneur that is not tied to the to government. And some of these, you know, have Spanish subtitles, and Instituto Acton in Argentina, making them available to others. So good luck with your effort. The next question comes from Eric Backstein. Eric represents FREE, which is a River Plate Foundation, works in Argentina, in Uruguay, and also in Venezuela. And he's asking, you know, it seems that among college students, you know, and in the academic circles, you know, there's a new idea that message that Jesus really was a socialist. And given that the academy already in arts, literature, and liberal arts, you know, the left has won in a way, it seems, the culture war. Are they supposed to take over Christianity? Is Christianity the next big field for the culture wars?
Well, I think to a very great extent, that's already happened. Liberation theology didn't die, it hibernated, and it's coming out in various forms now. The claim that Jesus was a socialist is, of course, a claim that Marx and Engels made many years ago, and it is a very superficial assertion. I think the best answer came from Winston Churchill in really drawing out the distinction. Churchill said that the socialism of the early Christians said, everything that I have, that I own, is yours. And the socialism of the modern day says, everything that you have is mine. Jesus and the apostles, even in the book of Acts, where they had all things common and they gave to each other, never coerced people. The radicality of this Christian form of social aid, which I don't like to call socialism because socialism is coercive, the radicality of the early Christian reciprocal support came from the fact that it was voluntary, came from the fact that it was the human heart that was consecrated to Jesus Christ. And not because I was being forced, I had money taken from me in my taxes or in other ways, or my business is controlled. We see that very clearly. And yes, I think there is a battle within Christian circles that needs to be responded to. It's one of the reasons that the Acton Institute exists. It's funny you should be asked this question because I'm just finishing a new book that'll be coming out at the end of the year, at least in English, dealing with the parables and economic questions. And I, in the end of the book, go into this assertion about Marx and Christian socialism and the various forms of prejudice in reading the scriptures. It seems that every time Jesus says something about wealth, it's seen as his advocacy of socialism. When he tells the young man who comes to him who's rich, he says to him, go sell all that you have and give to the poor and come follow me. People immediately say, well, see, Jesus is against wealth, he's against business, he's against enterprise. And I asked them, read the passage again. What's the first thing that Jesus calls the young man to do? Not to give away his property, to sell it. So the first thing Jesus asks him to do is to engage in enterprise, because that's where you get a good price. And if you're going to help the poor, and he asks him then to give away what he has sold, his possessions become a tool to glorify God. They become the path of his discipleship. And I think that's what's missing from the consciousness of many religious leaders. They just see wealth as exploitative, and it's not. Wealth is the indication that a person has planned well, that they have responded to human needs. That's why people buy their goods and services, because a need they had has been met and they're willing to exchange their money for that service or that good. Now, what you do with the wealth, that has profound moral obligations in terms of holding it lightly, not clutching it, not worshiping it, seeing it as a tool, as a means to a greater end rather than the end in itself. There is no justification morally, to my mind, of holding wealth as an end in itself. By the way, there's no economic justification for that too, because if that's all you do, if you don't put money to work, then you won't have money very long.
Father Robert, in that book that I mentioned about the conference that Acton Institute co-hosted in the Vatican about Centesimus Annus, you described it, and I completely agree. You said it was a grand effort in the history of ideas. with no need to get into personalities, you choose how you want to answer this one, but you did like 3 books, you know, and or with Acton Institute together with the Vatican, and then collaborated in other documents. You know, and now are these dialogues still possible? You know, why it seems that the Vatican has changed course in its dialogue with pro-free market economies. You know, how do you see it?
Well, I'm very sad because, you know, it's not just that people disagree. I mean, the church is Catholic, right? It's diverse, it's big. There's no one economic point of view that's given to us in the magisterium of the church. St. John the 23rd said that good Catholics can have differing ideas on prudential questions of politics, but that we must engage each other with fraternal charity. And if there's one word that appears over and over again in the Second Vatican Council, it's dialogue. And yet, I have to say, I'm very sad that the current administration in the Vatican is not open to dialogue. They say they are, but they're not dialoguing with people who disagree with them. They don't even understand people who disagree with them. I'm thinking not just about the Holy Father, but I'm thinking about a lot of his advisors. I'm thinking about your fellow Argentinian Marcelo Sanchez, who is the rector of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Science. I worked with him back under John Paul II, and we had different opinions and different discussions. But you look at the lists of people who have been invited to the conferences of the Pontifical Academies, and there are no people that represent my kinds of ideas. They don't have to invite me, but invite somebody who somehow represents. They actually took some of our people off the list that were invited. So I think it's very sad when you have people like Jeffrey Sachs invited to a conference who stands utterly opposed to everything the church believes about human life, and then refuses to invite other voices. Another person in the same line would be the editor of Civiltà Cattolica. This priest just simply doesn't get it. He wrote a long letter. I'm talking about now Father, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. It'll come to me. He wrote a whole long letter about traditional evangelicals and Catholics. And when you read the letter, and you know, the Acton Institute is not a Catholic institution, it's an ecumenical institution. Fully more than half of our support comes from evangelicals and our staff and our programs. So we know the evangelical world very well and dialogue with them. We have our theological disagreements, but the Acton Institute isn't a theological organization. It's an economic think tank that deals with ethics from a variety of perspectives. But when I read this letter, it is just profoundly, I'm sorry to use the word ignorant. It's very sad. And then we wrote and invited him and this Argentinian Presbyterian pastor to come to the United States to an Acton Institute seminar with 1,000 evangelicals and Catholics. We would provide all of the transportation, all of the costs, pay a suitable honorarium, just to engage us in conversation. Sent the letter in Italian, English, and Spanish, and just got a polite, no, too busy. You know, meanwhile, he goes to San Francisco to have meetings, you know, and things like that. So, I mean, it's very sad that this is the state of affairs, the intellectual state of affairs. And, you know, I'm speaking to many Argentinians. Some of you may know these people. Tell them we're interested in having conversation, and a respectful one, but a direct one, because that's the only way we can progress as honest Christian people.
Do you think, Father Robert, that part of the this animosity.
By the way, his name is Father Antonio Spadaro, Civiltà Cattolica. I don't remember.
Thank you.
Pastor, the president.
And Pastor Figueroa. And Cecilia Vasquez Hertz's Pastor Figueroa was the other one. Do you think that part of this animosity towards the free economy is due that some of these people believe that greed is the result of a particular economic system, and they see that capitalism creates more opportunity for greed, and so then they, instead of respecting the rights of individuals in the market, we see sometimes the church, as well as politicians, side with this the rights of social collectives. Suddenly, like in the United States now, people are not regarded like people. We are people of different genders, of different colors of skin. So, but how do you see this thing of the impact that you think that a prosperous economy might have on greed? Do you have opinions on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, greed is a vice, and it is a vice that is not the monopoly of people who live in free societies or people who are wealthy. Greed affects any of us. It's like saying that lust is the unique sin of married people, right? Because they engage in sexual relationships. Greed is a mistaken notion of or a mistaken expression of desire. It is a disordinate form of desire. We all desire things, right? We desire love, and when that becomes disordinate, it becomes lust. We desire food or clothing or shelter, and when that desire, that material desire, becomes inordinate, it becomes financial greed, an idolatry. But to say that the primary motive of people who act in a market economy, who make profits, is greed, reveals that the person simply doesn't know business people. Not really. I mean, are some of them greedy? Yes, but the vast majority of them are not. And there's a lot more that can be said about greed, but the thing I would like to ask my progressive or socialist friends to consider is, if greed is the vice that is operative in the ethos of a capitalist society, what role does envy play in the ethos of a socialist society? And isn't that an equally damnable vice that needs to be condemned? And yet I never hear socialists address that question. Now, let me make another point, and this is a bit of a complicated point. It's complicated for me to express it, but I'm gonna try to articulate it. Here's what we know historically. We know that in roughly the last 200 years, that there's been an astounding rise out of poverty of all people in all nations, almost everywhere in the world. We know that for most of human history, people lived at subsistence levels, that there were certain people who lived at higher levels, but these were usually politicians or monarchs and things like this. But that roughly 200 years ago, we see this line shoot up like a hockey puck, and that we're living in the most prosperous era of human history ever on this planet. What caused that? The answer to that we know. Adam Smith answers it in the Inquiry to the Wealth, the Cause of the Wealth of Nations. It is the expansion of the division of labor. It's not charity that's resulted in that. Now, by the way, I need to say here at this point that is not to say that some people are not living under difficult economic circumstances. That's not my point. but we have so many more people on the planet than we've ever had before, which is itself a testimony to the prosperity that our world is experiencing. Now, here's how this has happened, and this is the complicated point. It's not that everybody has risen all at once. It is true that the rich are getting richer. It's also true that the poor are getting richer. It is not true that the poor are getting poorer, except perhaps in Venezuela under socialism, or in Cuba, places like that. The problem is, and I think this is the thing that keeps feeding the greed accusation, is that people don't advance at the same rate. They advance, but some people arrive before others. Not because of injustice, not because they have stolen anything from anyone else, though there are plenty of examples of that, especially as the globalized economy becomes more politicized. But to the extent that it is a free economy, some people will arrive at prosperity before others. The question is, would you rather destroy this mechanism of economic prosperity for all people? Because if the only morally tolerable economic system is a system that has everybody rising at the same time, what we will have is a collapse of the economy and a return to subsistence living. So I think this is where envy comes into the question. If you can let go of your envy that somebody is doing better than me, and that it's not their fault that I'm not doing as well as them, then I think we can tend to the needs of the poor. We can enable the poor to be better off. Now, of course, this is just an economic and, in a sense, a material analysis. There are other and deeper and I think more profound questions of spirituality and total human well-being, but that gives us a part of the issue.
You bring the topic of envy, and again, those of us who have studied the fathers of the church, the great theologians, it seems that if ever a document comes on envy, the church could not go wrong. But we have, as you say, we have not seen a document on envy, which really we need. Why do you have any idea why we seldom hear from the Vatican and higher authorities and the bishops chat about envy?
No, I have no idea why. Unless they're reading theology through an ideological lens. And I think these people, I don't say everyone in the Vatican is this, but I think people who write on these kinds of questions come at them with ideological blinders on. You only have to read the, I'm just looking, by the way, right now, just because you mentioned it, I'm looking, of course, at Gustavo Gutierrez's book, Theology of Liberation. I'm doing this book, and so I was writing this book, so I was back and forth. There's no thing on envy here. There's not a thing on it. There's a lot of denunciations of private property and all the rest of it, as you know, from having read the corpus of Theology of Liberation. And then when I read somebody like Leonardo Boff or Ernesto Cardinal, it is so obvious to me that they have these economic blinders on, and they don't engage the question of how are we going to help the poor on a practical level. I mean, other than wishing them well, how are we going to help them to engage in business? Because we know that business and exchange and the division of labor is the way that people rise out of poverty. But some people love the poor so much they want to keep them poor. Because what are they going to do if they don't have poor people?
Father Sirico, I know that you said you didn't want to mention names, but I will mention names. You know, in that
I've been mentioning names all along, haven't I?
Well, I don't know. Sorry about in economics. In economics, you say, well,
Yes.
Some liberal economists all knew conflated the theories of economic liberalism with moral libertinism, viewing them as one and the same and as mutually reinforcing. You have touched upon this, but a good friend, you know, John Estados, a wonderful journalist, came from the left. From attacking corporations, he started defending corporations. And I don't know if he changed it, but in his movie about greed, you know, he starts with little cuts of putting Imelda Marcos and her mountains of shoes, you know, at par with another rich businessman. And when you speak, you know, the questions about inequality, you know, two-thirds of the world today, according to the World Justice Project and Transparency International, doesn't have rules of the game that are fair. They don't have rule of law. Right. And you have spoken about crony capitalism, that there are enormous areas from central banking to oil, from shipbuilding, the spectrum that we are using, where the government is totally involved. And what we see, rather than the free economy that you dream about and we want, we see this this crony, whatever you want to call it, crony capitalism, corporate welfare, or crony socialism. Yeah? You think we should pay more attention to this sins in these economic process, and not to say economic systems, or we should continue to stress the positive, you know, like so many millions came out of poverty when some of this corrupt, India, which is still corrupt, and China, which is still communist, but they started moving towards market incentives, and we have never seen so many people come out, as you say, from extreme poverty. So how should we balance, you know, this between our pointing the fingers against corruption, against cronyism, and speaking about the beauties and the great creative capacity of free economies?
Well, I think we just have to be truth seekers and truth tellers, not personal assassins of people's reputations. You know, John Stossel I like very much. I consider him a friend. When we're together, we have a good time. But it's interesting you mentioned his program on greed. I was interviewed for that. He flew me in to New York and interviewed me for an hour. Now, I appear in the documentary for all of probably 10 seconds. And the reason for that is that for an hour, he wanted me to say that greed was good. He asked, who did more for the human race, Mother Teresa or Michael Millikan? And I have nothing against Michael Millikan, but to equate greed with economic success or the motive of economic success, I think is to concede the moral case to the socialists. And so for an hour, he tried to get me to do that. And I think there's one line that I have in the documentary. I think we need to say the truth and make the distinction between the idea, the philosophy of liberty, human liberty, and the philosophy of libertinism. Human liberty is based on the human need to exercise our minds and our consciences, and it recognizes that the totality of our life is not our freedom, but the moral commitments that we make. But in order to make those moral commitments, we have to have freedom. I think libertinism is far too simplistic and self-destructive. I think there are ways in which we can advocate for free and virtuous society that don't utilize the mechanisms of the state. And I think we have to be examples of that by being willing to even criticize friends and to point out where there are errors or disagreements that we have, and then have that conversation with friends of ours like John Stossel, as we'd like to have with Father Spadaro or Pope Francis.
Father Robert, we started with a question, or one of the first questions was about politics. In rare cases, we have seen unity in those who oppose socialism, but this time a lot of disunity in the non-socialist side is coming due to views about the family and family policy. And in 2001, in this book that you also have, Globalization, Economics, and the Family, you say that we need to construct the framework for pro-family legislation, pro-family cultural attitude and practice, and you were calling, let us find meaningful ways to do that, So what are your thoughts, on this regard? What do you regard as healthy pro-family legislation or a cultural attitudes towards the family?
Well, I think it is a sad move on the part of people who are on our side of many of these economic questions, liberals, economic liberals, which I consider myself to be, who are now denigrating the importance of stable families from our point of view, from my point of view. The human person is the greatest resource that the human race has. And people need to be raised in families, stable, traditional family units. The enemy of that, historically, and I think in a way, Karl Marx and Engels understood this question at a deeper level than some of these liberals that we're talking about now, again, friends, understood that private property and the nuclear family were intertwined, that when we disregard the family, we come up with alternatives that were very destructive for society as a whole. I don't think that Russia is healed from those experiments with socialism. And I would also make a prediction that China is about to experience the same thing because of the years of the one-child policy and the disregard for human life by forcibly aborting children. This does not mean that the way to remedy this is to get a bunch of politicians elected, if you even could at this stage, and begin subsidizing marriage or some of these family-friendly policies. I think it is enough. I think that the family is a natural enough institution that if you just clear the road and allow people to be free, allow an economy to be prosperous, and protect vulnerable human life from attack and manipulation, which to my mind would mean removing all of the subsidies from the United Nations and the World Bank that are anti-natalist, pro-abortion, and anti-family. I think that would be sufficient to see a robust return of the family. I think the family is a natural institution, and people fight it at their peril. It's kind of like the natural law. The philosopher Yves Simon once said, "The natural law always buries its undertakers." And I think that it does that because it's natural. It's part of, and we're fighting. We can't fight that kind of thing by imitating what we fight.
Father Sirico, I will ask you for a word of hope. I know how generous you have been with your time your work, your prayers with the Venezuelans, for example. It's just more than 2 decades.
It breaks my heart. Breaks my heart.
Yeah, and some fear that Argentina is going on the same direction, and people are losing hope. And this being the ending of this marvelous 6th session. Thank you so much, UCEMA and Institute Acton, and all of you who are listening. How will you give us, or give the people in this difficult circumstance, hope to continue in this holy battle for freedom?
I guess that's my job, isn't it? Because, as a priest, and despair, that ranks up there with greed and envy in terms of capital sins. Let me put it this way, and this is an insight both from the church, but also I think from people like Friedrich Hayek. And that is to say that the culture of life, by its nature, replenishes itself. A culture of death, by its nature, immolates itself. That's why Mises in 1921 saw that socialism would collapse, because it can't calculate. Socialism isn't false economics, it's anti-economics. And I think the same principle is involved with regard to culture as a whole, that where socialism has been practiced, culture has diminished. It has become desiccated. The vulgarity of the masses, the art, the politicized music, and all of the rest of it. Whereas where, freedom and the human person has been valued, things fructify, they flourish. And I think our hope, though we need to be realistic about this and not, not fanciful about it. Ultimately, we win because we know who we read the last page of the book. But that's not to say that we're going to see it, that this generation will see it. We have to make the sacrifices for the next generation. I often think about the fact that the architects of the beautiful basilica in Rome, San Pietro, were Bramante and Michelangelo. And it's astounding to think that they never saw St. Peter's Basilica, conceived the idea, but they left it to the next generations to build the actual cathedral. And that's what we need to be doing. And that's what you are doing. We are building the next generation. These people who are listening to this are smart people. They're going to take bits and pieces of this and work it over and put it together and rewrite it and retell it in their own circumstances. And they're going to pass this on because the truth is compelling on its own terms, on its own merits. We don't have to coerce people into believing it, but we have to propose it in an able way, in a professional way, in a way that respects our interlocutors, including those with whom we disagree. We have to be winsome about it and not be discouraged, not give in to the despair that the socialist ideology wants, because then we look for the hand of the state to support us. No, I think the culture of life will win over the culture of death in the end. Resurrexit, sicut dixit.
I want to ask someone who embodies these virtues, of optimism, of education for the long term, of serious research, Edgardo Zablowski and his university for having hosted us. And I ask Edgardo to close this first series of the Lord Acton chair. Thank you, Edgardo, and thank you, Mercedes, for your.
Thank you all for having me here.
No. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Padre Cirilo. Thank you for this talk. It was just great. And thank you, Alex, for this cycle. I hope we will have it again this year. It was great, really it was great. And thank you, Mercedes, for the organization of all this. Without, you know, without your work every day, this would not work as it works. For me, very easy, it's just to come here and say, thank you, everybody, and make questions. But you are working in this, so please, Mercedes, you can close this.
Thank you very much, Edgardo. For me, it was a big pleasure to work all these sessions with Alejandro. Alejandro was incredibly helpful, and it's such an honor to have Father Sirico himself closing the cycle. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for all the assistants. They have been with us all these months. And we hope to have a new season this year. So this is for you, Alex, the challenge. I hope we can have this again at the end of 2021. And well, thank you a lot, Alex, for helping to bring us this thing together. It is difficult from Argentina in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, and you were incredible, helpful, and efficient to do this, to become true. So thank you a lot. Thank you, Father Sirico. Thank you, Edgardo. And thank everybody here, including Cecilia Vasquez-Her, who was very helpful also in inviting people from Argentina to our sessions of the Lord Acton chair. So thank you, everybody, and thank you again.
God bless you all.
Bye-bye, and thank you again.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye, Alex. Thank you. Really, thank you.
Privilegio, Edgardo.
Hope to see you soon.
Gracias, Alex. Muchas gracias por todo. Gracias a Cecilia también.
Para mí es un privilegio. Chao, chao.
Chao.